The movie opens with an old communist documentary showcasing how the Soviets fought off the Nazis during the Battle of Madrid in 1936. The setting is Bilbao, a city in the northern part of Spain. An American journalist named Henry is watching the documentary in disgust, and when a Soviet soldier asks for a hip flask, he refuses. The soldier informs Henry that it isn't his war, and Henry agrees but remarks that he is still there, nonetheless. Elsewhere, a young Spanish woman arrives on a bike to an office where she works. There she is greeted by her boss, named Vasil, who has very clearly got a crush on her as he gives her a gift as well as a bouquet for returning safely from Madrid. The Spanish Civil War is in full flow, and Teresa confirms that her trip to Madrid was a dangerous one. Elsewhere in Bilbao, Henry has fallen asleep in the theater, while his assistant Marta is taking pictures of a German bomber pilot being beaten by the public. She is annoyed to find Henry inside, sleeping under his hat. The two exit the theater, and an angry Marta asks Henry what kind of journalist he has become. He replies that he would like to avoid getting involved in war at this point in his life. Since he has witnessed the horrors of war, he will make up a war story his paper is desperately searching for and send it back. Back at the office, Teresa is being asked out by Vasil, who has 2 tickets to the Bach concert. She accepts, although she states that she prefers Shostakovich, who has been imprisoned by the Soviets. Vasil is himself Russian, and emphasizes that he doesn't agree with the methods employed by his homeland. Henry and Marta arrive at a battlefield where Spanish troops are engaged in battle with Soviet forces. Marta is keen to rush into the battlefield to get a better picture, but she is stopped in her tracks by Henry. He reveals that his interpreter is in jail, and the newspaper won't help him. This could also be Marta's fate if she's not careful. However, she ignores Henry's warnings and runs into the line of danger, only just surviving enemy gunfire. On their way back to the city, Henry, who is driving, asks Marta why she doesn't consider becoming a fashion or sports photographer, as it would be much safer. Marta doesn't answer, instead pointing out that a German plane is flying above them. Henry immediately shouts at Marta to exit the car, and the two of them run for safety. However, Marta tries to run back to save their equipment and papers. Just then, the plane circles back and blows up their car, sending them flying back. Henry and Marta arrive back at the office where they meet Marco, a Portuguese journalist who is an acquaintance of theirs. Marco has secretly been writing articles for the fascists, and is warned by Henry that what he's doing is risky, though he doesn't care. Marta walks up to Marco, and she speaks to him softer than she has spoken to any other man in the movie so far. Henry gets on the phone with his editor in New York, named George. He asks him to be transferred to Paris, so he can write an article about Picasso. However, he declines, stating that he wants war. Unbeknownst to anyone, a group of Nazi soldiers have been posted just outside the city of Bilbao. Later, Henry, Marta, and Marco are introduced to Teresa, who is happy to finally meet Henry, as she reveals that she constantly read his articles while in college. However, she questions why he blatantly lied in an article he wrote about a town named Bergara and a battle at a castle, as Bergara has no castles. Henry is speechless, but he plays it off by replying that he must have got the name of the town wrong. Teresa is furious as she believes Henry is playing with something the Spanish people consider life and finality. Vasil walks into the room and asks Henry to obey the rules, which annoys Henry. Teresa asks them to continue their work, but to stay away from the border. Henry storms off, leaving Marta to approach Maria, a colleague of Teresa's, to ask for a camera and some film. The Nazis posted outside of Bilbao are led by Colonel von Richthofen, who wants his men to be disciplined, as they have a chance to avenge their country's loss in the Great War. Meanwhile, Henry is sulking over Teresa calling him out over the inaccuracies of his article. Marco reassures him that she is just doing her job. He says this while simultaneously flirting with Marta. Teresa stares at him from her office window, and Vasil reminds her that Americans care about nothing, after Teresa suggests that Henry could be useful to them. Vasil arrives at his office and Maria informs him that a Mr. Consul from the Soviet Union has arrived to see him, who is a high-ranking official in Vasil's home country. Consul and his men are searching through files in Vasil's office when Vasil approaches him and asks for an update on his brother Nikolai. The consul reveals that Vasil and Nikolai have been punished for their support of the Trotskyites. Vasil asks what he must do to save his brother, but the consul simply states that he should bring him an enemy of the revolution, and that is all. Henry finds Maria and asks if it would be possible to send some of his work back to New York without it being subject to censorship checks. Maria explains that it is possible, but expensive. Just then, they are interrupted by Teresa, who asks him if he would like to go sightseeing with her, which he reluctantly agrees to. Maria, Teresa, Marta, Marco, and Henry head out to go sightseeing at the cliffs of northern Spain, even though Vasil protests Teresa spending time with Henry. Once there, Henry asks Teresa if they can start over, to which she agrees. He then asks her why she works for the censorship department, and she reveals that she wants to be a writer, but circumstances limit her choices. She states that she is a loyalist and wants democracy in Spain. While this is happening, the Nazi soldiers are planning to bomb a Spanish town as a birthday present for Hitler. Back at the cliffs, Henry asks Teresa about the brooch she wears, mistaking it for a revolution pin. Teresa reveals that it was her father's brooch for the football team he supported, Athletic Bilbao. She states that she misses her late father. However, she disappointed him as she ran away from the wedding he arranged for her. Later, they arrive at a hospital, where Teresa introduces Henry to children with horrific injuries from the civil war that is happening. She asks for Henry's help, for him to get the story of what's going on there in New York. The group then heads off to a town named Guernica, and once there, Teresa offers to give them a tour of the Basque region, despite Maria's protests. Elsewhere, Richthofen is having his men prepare for the attack. The Nazis are working with fascist forces in Spain, who are led by Francisco Franco. Their target is the Basque region. Meanwhile, Vasil meets with the consul and his men, who have captured an innocent man on the suspicion of him being a spy. The consul instructs Vasil to eliminate the man. However, Vasil doesn't want to. Henry, along with Marta, Marco, and Teresa, arrives at her aunt's home. There, she introduces them to her aunt, uncle, and cousin Isabella. Vasil is enjoying his time far less, and the consul is pushing him to murder the supposed spy. He states he has never shot a man, and the consul ends up pulling the trigger. He informs Vasil that Moscow denounces someone every day to keep the people in line. He wants Vasil to bring him a big catch, or else they will not speak about Nikolai. At lunch with the family, Teresa's uncle begins to play his accordion, and she and Henry are about to dance when suddenly they spot a German plane. The plane opens fire but luckily misses everyone. This ordeal startles Henry, who attempts to write about it. When Teresa arrives back at the office, Vasil is furious. He is angry that not only did Teresa allow Henry to write what he has, but she invited him to her family home. Henry comes to see Teresa, who informs him that they are unable to approve his recent article. Vasil comes into the room, informing Henry to write what they ask him, which makes him furious. He accuses Teresa of deceiving him and rejects Vasil's offer to go to Russia. Vasil then informs him that he knows that Henry ran away and left his interpreter in Ethiopia when Italian soldiers came for him. This infuriates Henry, who is close to punching Vasil but lets him go. Later, Henry is in his room when Teresa leaves a note for him, asking him to meet her at 7:39. However, he is unable to do so when Vasil has more work for her. Vasil invites Teresa to a reception tomorrow night, which she accepts. The next day, Teresa arrives at the reception with Vasil and Maria. Henry is also in attendance, along with Marco and Marta. Teresa approaches Henry, who is still upset with her, and explains that she had no choice but to censor his article. Henry suggests the two of them dance and informs her that he may be leaving, which upsets her. He listens to her concerns, and the two share a kiss in front of Vasil, who is heartbroken. Teresa and Henry find a room that stores art, hiding it from the fascists. The two end up making love. The next day, the two arrive at the office together. Teresa gifts Henry her father's brooch, and they kiss. However, the consul and his men are also at the office that day. Vasil is planning to sell Henry out to them, and plants an approval stamp on his coat. The consul's men search the office and find the stamp in Henry's coat. However, Teresa claims the coat is hers, as her father's brooch is on it because she gifted it to Henry. Vasil looks at her in worry, taking her away and pleading she recants her statement. Henry tries to call out to her, but is stopped by the consul's men. Meanwhile, Richthofen's men have been ordered to carry out a 3-day bombing raid in just one afternoon. Their target, Guernica. Henry confronts Vasil, who draws his gun at him. He states that what happens to Teresa is no longer his concern and demands Henry leave his office. Henry then turns to Maria, who pleads with him to leave. Marta and Marco arrive, informing Henry that Teresa is being held in a Soviet prison in Guernica. Later, Vasil asks the consul if he will release his brother now that he has handed him an enemy of the people. The consul hands him his brother's pocket watch, informing him that it is too late and that he is no longer alive. Vasil is taken to the location they are keeping Teresa in. He asks them to stop, but they begin to torture Teresa by spraying her down with a water hose. Vasil covers his ears to not hear Teresa's screams. After it is over, Vasil, with tears in his eyes, asks Teresa to sign a piece of paper that confirms that she is a traitor. but she refuses. Henry, Marta, and Marco arrive in Guernica, as do the German bombers, which prompt the Soviets as well as Vasil to evacuate and leave Teresa on her own. The bombing of Guernica intensifies. Marco and Marta find shelter while Henry runs into Isabel, looking for Teresa. He stops Isabel from trying to save her wedding dress at the tailor's and has her reunite with her family at the shelter. Henry arrives at the prison and finds Teresa in a terrible state, crying and traumatized, asking Henry to never leave her again. Meanwhile, Vasil is also looking for Teresa, but is unable to find her. While running through the streets together, Henry and Teresa witness the horrors of war. Homes were destroyed, and bodies littered all over the ground. They arrive at a shelter full of people, but Henry comments that the roof can collapse at any moment, so they run for it. They eventually meet Marco and Marta, and the four of them attempt to get to safety. However, both Teresa and Henry are caught in an explosion. Henry gets Teresa to her feet, but she collapses, and a nun pronounces her deceased. He holds her body, crying when Vasil arrives holding a gun. When he realizes that Teresa isn't alive, he points the gun at himself and pulls the trigger. After a while, an old acquaintance of Henry's arrives with a car after he hears what is happening on the radio. Marta and Henry head to the press office, but Marco stays, looking around at the destroyed town and crying. Once he arrives at the office, Henry hands Teresa's brooch to Maria, who begins sobbing and asks for a line to New York. While crying, he informs George that he has a war story for him, and it involves a small town in the north of Spain.